David Iber, and I will be discussing browser tracking and privacy. This recording is not meant to debate the merits or the negatives of browser tracking. For the most part, browser tracking, though it happens covertly to most people, is meant for things like finding what we want faster, retrieving information for returning users, like previous sessions or items in a shopping cart, and confirming one's identity for things like banking and purchases. But I believe people should be aware of the identifiable information they're broadcasting over the internet, especially since this information can and sometimes does fall into the wrong hands. They should have a choice over whether they should broadcast this data in the first place. I wanted to start by discussing the purpose and history of web trafficking, then jumping to web tracking tools used by various services such as ad brokers, and finally some privacy tools internet users can adopt to get a sense of their level of privacy or enhance it. History of web tracking, I will start by discussing cookies. As web developers, we know what cookies are. A server sends a set of cookies to the browser containing a text string with anything ranging from information about a user or a browser or just a session identification. The browser then uses this information on the local machine for future use, like when the browser sends requests to the same web server it received the cookies from, and the web server then uses this to identify the user. I've selected two articles that discuss cookies in the greater context of internet privacy, which highlight the change in perspective towards cookies as the internet landscape changed more and tracking tools became implemented on the web. The first article from 1999 basically is an introduction to the public about cookies. The author mentions cookies as these new things that are stored on our computers from e-commerce sites, but can be retrieved by embedded elements from ad companies. There's an air of suspicion and mistrust to this article. The second article, as you can probably tell by the title, is warning of new ways websites are tracking users' information. This is where browser fingerprinting comes into the picture. It refers to these new ways users are being tracked in very discrete and hard to detect and evade manners in comparison to cookies. Plain cookies we just talked about, which may simply store information about a user or a browser. There are also super cookies or ever cookies. These cookies are injected into HTTP requests by one's own ISP and are hard to detect and remove because of where in the networking process they come into the picture. Super cookies overwhelmingly tend to be viewed as malicious and have been the subject of many costly lawsuits to ISPs. A well-known button on a website other than Facebook, like next to an article on a news site or next to a product on an e-commerce site. This is known as a web beacon. Web beacons are specifically meant for tracking and analytics by websites other than the site you are currently visiting. Oftentimes, web beacons are 1x1 pixel images or completely transparent, so they go completely unseen. It's a free service by the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which allows users of the internet to see that with some relatively simple JavaScript, information about their browser such as plugin details and settings, other software such as the specific operating system, logged in accounts, and location. All these details combine to make a unique fingerprint, known as a browser fingerprint, that can distinguish one browser from hundreds of thousands, if not millions, with amazing accuracy. Because of the interconnectivity of the internet, these fingerprint details can be matched with other data, such as one's name, so that a user is always specifically identifiable. Mechanisms include ones that track a user's location. I have included Google's GEOLOCATION API, which identifies a user's approximate longitude and latitude using this simple JavaScript inside the browser. A common tracking mechanism is called canvas fingerprinting. This method takes advantage of the slightly different way graphics are rendered in a certain space by devices in order to create unique fingerprints to identify specific devices. Discuss tracking mechanisms that identify unique fingerprints in the browser, I'd like to discuss some ways of hiding or obscuring some of these fingerprints. One way to delete files mounted onto local storage is to use the incognito or private modes in the browser, which delete these files once you exit the browser. All modern web browsers now have this functionality. Web browsers have many plugins to spoof a user agent, which has many of the same identifying details as a complete browser fingerprint. Don't forget that these plugins themselves can easily be identified by some JavaScript code, as we saw before. This concludes my presentation on browser tracking. I hope this serves as a good introduction to the subject, and as someone with keen interest in networking and security, I will definitely be pursuing this topic further.